glad to be here. Thank you, Besma. Besma's such a great representative of the Balsillie School and the UW community. So it's great to be here with you all in the Waterloo AI Institute. I'm really appreciative of this discussion. So in terms of Jack and Laura, I know them both, and I'm quite pleased that you're both here. And I want to really start by focusing on you as the developers, right? As the people who know how to make these technologies. So developers and designers of new technologies, particularly those working behind the scenes, spending hours building models and writing code, are increasingly becoming more vocal in views on the way the technology is used. And students entering the field of AI are also concerned about, becoming more engaged in understanding their role as well, and all of these concerns about applications of AI in society. And so, I'm best to introduce us all. So I'm just really interested, Laura and Jack, maybe to start with a basic question. What are some actual applications that we've probably already seen or will see in terms of military applications of AI? And more importantly, from your perspective, what are some of these discussions presenting sort of a sanitized view of the applications? Are we talking about it in 2 minutes? So why don't we see you and then go to Jack?
Absolutely. Hi. Yeah, great question. So starting off with how AI is currently being used by militaries. We've seen a bunch of things, and a lot of them are not objectionable, at least not in my view. So you've got things like the artificial intelligence co-pilot, which is designed to get unconscious pilots to fly them back to fly them and land them. That's a fairly, I think, innocuous use of AI. We've got stuff like there's research into using machine learning and AI to implement cybersecurity, so to use them as sort of a fancy vulnerability scanner and to even potentially patch vulnerabilities, which seems to be getting some sort of traction. And then there's things like interest in sort of machine learning based language translations, so natural language stuff. I mean, that was definitely part of the JEDI contract, which was the big contract that Microsoft and Amazon have been fighting over. Then there's sort of normal stuff like logistics and planning out repairs. Sort of bomb disposal robots are definitely an active area of work. And then we get into the things that are more contested, for sure. So things like anything that involves, I think, target selection and identification are the particularly tricky things. And as well, things like determining whether targets are what the sort of collateral damage will be. So you've got things like the collateral damage estimation tool, or also known as BugSlut. And then you've also got stuff like Skynet, which aims to detect terroristness or insurgentness from mobile phone patterns. And then you've got analysis of wide area motion imagery, so Project Maven, which aims to sort of track people and vehicles around areas where wide area motion imagery surveillance is being used, and to sort of feed that into further layers of the analysis process. So most people think that the potential future is more and more autonomy in weapon systems. So weapons, particularly the critical functions, which are target selection, identification, and the decision to use force. So there's sort of the interest there, I think, for two big reasons. One interest is to fight faster. So there's a lot of kind of dialogue around fighting at machine speed. There's also interest in being able to operate in areas where there isn't network connectivity, where people are using communication jamming. So there's two sort of big, I guess, warfare paradigms. One of them would be sort of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and these sort of more targeted approaches, where you're mostly dealing with mobile targets, people, vehicles, and then you've got the sort of the classic air-land warfare idea, where you're looking at tanks and you're looking at fighter aircraft and more sort of traditional military material stuff. And I think those have quite different implications. As in terms of the sanitization, I think we definitely are getting a sanitized view. So there's very much a discourse, if you listen to any of the, particularly what states parties say, who may be in favor of more AI. They say things like, this will actually, it will make life safer for civilians, for combatants, for everybody. That you got more precision. I think we need to be a little bit skeptical, very skeptical at this point, frankly. And the reason that we should be skeptical is with the precision discourse, precision is actually made up of three things. So how accurate are you at striking the thing that you're aiming at is one aspect. And another aspect is how big is the blast radius when the thing that you fired hits the thing that you aimed at. And then the third thing was, did you correctly identify that point as being a military target at all? So, the accuracy issue is sort of has been solved with precision munitions largely for quite some time. The blast radius thing is, it's more about the, how much explosive is in the weapon that you fire. And then, so it's really the identification of targets and estimation of collateral damage aspect is the place, I think, where people are looking to AI and to autonomy to try and improve that. But the problem is, I think it just doesn't sort of stand up as a narrative because what we're asking of these entirely sort of theoretical so far systems is a very, very difficult problem. It's the problem of correctly distinguishing between competence and non-competence, and that's something that humans have, which have great advantages over machine learning and artificial intelligence systems. Human beings struggle with this task quite routinely. I think it's an example of a very high risk, very difficult task that really benefits from human judgment, the ability to understand context, and the ability to actually sort of think through a situation as opposed to just applying some sort of statistical patterns. But the problem is, I think we've already seen a lot of this sort of sanitized view of precision warfare around the area of remote weaponry drones. And I think what we see over time is that this narrative that these weapons are so precise, it means that over time you get a lot of strikes. And even if each individual strike kills a relatively low number of civilians compared to area bombing, but people always say, well, should we do Dresden-style area bombing instead? And obviously the answer is no, but over time, a lot of civilians die in strikes, and that is obviously not good. So probably Jack has some things to say.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, Jack,
hopefully it's all right that I'm not enabling my video. The audio was cutting out quite a bit. So I guess to complement what Laura was talking about, I would focus a lot on sort of what's downstream and how the military applications connect to domestic issues. It's no secret that a lot of the AI technology will end up being used or already is being used at borders, whether in the US by the Department of Homeland Security or then later on used by police force. I think the example of full motion video is a great one. Obviously, it started out in use in Afghanistan for so-called attack the network strategies for kind of rooting out terrorist networks. And then it ended up being widely deployed by the Department of Homeland Security to surveil the border with drones and through tethered aerostats, et cetera. And then it's also, I'm sure everyone's aware, it's been flown over cities like Boston by companies like Persistent Surveillance Systems and even funded by philanthropic organizations like Arnold Ventures, which actually funds a lot of civil liberties organizations you all know the name of, including some journalistic outfits. So these things are not as much of a pariah as I think a lot of people might assume. But then the other side that I think isn't nearly discussed enough is the social media surveillance side of militarism. So I actually have even FOIA requests from the US Defense Innovation Unit for a twin pair of contracts. One of them was to Palantir, who I'm sure most people know the name of. The other for the same project was to a company called Transvoyant, which roughly speaking is a spin out of Lockheed Martin, which does similar common operating picture technology, which if you're not familiar with that buzzword, think a dashboard to integrate a bunch of data feeds on a map. And so something you might want to do is have a map of your country or your target country, and to have a live stream of tweets that you may find to be particularly political or relevant to your mission. And so that's been going on for a long time. And in fact, one of these FOIAs showed that Transvoyant was explicitly monitoring so-called political climates alongside, keeping track of weapon system status for the Air Force. And so, to some degree, one could think of it as analogous to monitoring the weather, in the sense that you want to have very intense surveillance on communication channels to have an understanding for what people are doing. And I could talk about that a lot more, but I think the connection to very serious sort of GEOINT satellite surveillance, even to social media, is something that there's a lot of documentation for as well. And in the way some people describe it is having a so-called ground truth from satellite imagery, because everybody has to be somewhere at every point in time. And so, can you connect an IP address and, say a Twitter account to, perhaps another way of measuring what people were doing at any point in time to de-anonymize them. So anyway, I'll sort of stop there, but was trying to get at the fact that downstream, all of these things we talk about are going to have domestic implications. And in fact, the one I missed that I should have talked about is that autonomous weapons obviously will also be used for autonomous so-called less lethal weapons. So a perfect example of this, there's a company in Australia, I think Cyborg Dynamics is their name, but I'd have to look it up, that did a podcast talking about their autonomous drone with their little grenade launcher on it. And they were saying that their international market was actually to sell, to replace the grenade launcher with tear gas so that police could use it on protesters. And so literally a week later, after I read about that and listened to the podcast, the IDF deployed drones which were shooting tear gas at Palestinians during some of that conflict. And so I think, to kind of paraphrase William Gibson, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think you can look to borders to get a sense of what's coming domestically.
Thank you so much, Jack. That's so informative, and I'm a bit to questionability, and does that lethal aspect of the weapons discussion happening at the international levels has certainly been something that countries have also debated, right? Should we be banning things that are lethal, and what about less lethal options as well? So there's a lot of interesting things to pick up on later as well. And you've spoken, Jack, a little bit now about sort of the more domestic context, but do you have specific technical concerns about the deployment of AI technologies in conflict contexts? So maybe, Jack, could we hear from you and then from Laura on that?
I mean, obviously the biggest issue is accountability with respect to things like drone swarms, which is, I think, where the issue is most likely to come to the front first, which is, so obviously the argument that the US typically makes is that you want to have, say, one member of the military controlling an entire drone swarm. So that implies essentially coaching the system in some way, as opposed to micromanaging what each particular drone does. And so there's a question of whether then, if you have that drone swarm, what does it mean to actually select a target? Is it enough to say that anyone in a building is fair game? Like, is it anybody in a square mile that some facial recognition system uses the traditionally vague notion of who's a non-combatant or not, which might be anyone that let's say a male over a certain age, according to their, say computer vision algorithm. So obviously a lot of these determinations are going to switch over to computer vision algorithms for determining who's a non-combatant. And so to me, there's kind of a question there of, is that a kill decision to have even the determination of whether they're a combatant or not? And so, I'm nowhere near as knowledgeable of the details in the policy as I'm sure everyone else on the panel is, especially Laura. But that's one major issue, is that sort of the technicalities of what it even means to select a target. But I mean, so that's obviously a question of accountability there, and then it's also a very old argument dating back to quite a few philosophers from even in, say, the 40s, of the notion that once you have weapons that don't have a human at the pointy end of the sphere, that you're going to be more likely to commit atrocities, because ultimately it's often the kind of the people that were being forced to commit the act that are the ones that ultimately objected. And so I think there's that very serious question of well, then who objects once there's autonomy, and like what is, like, to what degree can there be large-scale atrocities with a very small group of people determining that it happens. But anyway, I think Laura could probably answer that question a lot better.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about atrocities. I'm going to leave my video off as well, because I've noticed that when other people are speaking with video on, I'm getting cutting out, so it's probably better. So I think there really are definite concerns specific to war zones, and I think it comes particularly where you have artificial intelligence starting to get into the decision-making process around the use of force. And I would even go broader than to say artificial intelligence, but software and automation in general. And the reason for that is, these are just such high-risk, consequential decisions, and in such very difficult environments. So, where it comes to machine learning and AI, obviously you're using it for primarily things like sensing, detecting objects, and detecting anomalies and kind of interesting patterns. And these then feed into, a decision, or either a decision, an application of force, which is kind of where we're mostly not yet, for the few limited exceptions, or more frequently to a suggestion to a person that this might be a valid target to use force against. Or this can also take the form of sort of the software turning into a box to be ticked. So being part of, like, military planning process around making strikes tends to be fairly lengthy. There's a lot goes on before you actually get to that decision to fire, right? And there's definitely been a huge degree of creeping softwareization of that targeteering process. So one of the applications is this thing called BugStat, or the collateral damage estimation tool. And what this basically does is the people who are doing the targeting decision making, they put in parameters about where they want to strike and what kind of weapon they want to use. And the tool has been programmed with some information about the buildings in the area and sort of population densities, and from that it can make an estimation of how many people are likely to be, or how many non-combatants are likely to be killed in that strike or wounded. And so famously, there was a threshold set. There's in military terms, in IHL, International Humanitarian Law, there's this concept of proportionality, which basically says that for a strike to be legal, or according to IHL, the amount of civilian collateral damage should be proportional to the military advantage gained. However, you'll notice that military advantage isn't really a number, whereas civilian damage, at least in terms of deaths, you can quantify. Your problem is you're trying to build software here to compare a non-quantifiable property like military advantage with a number of deaths, and to make that determination, and that's very difficult. So, you know, software engineers being software engineers, if we are terrible, terrible people, what do? They said 30. 30 is the magic number. If you have less than 30 deaths, it's grand. If you have more than 30 deaths, you need to go and have that reviewed by senior command. So people have done research into this and sort of how this impacted human behavior, and they found that what people would essentially do is they would try and tweak parameters, like, you know, a meter here, a meter there, to try and get that number under 30, so that they wouldn't have to go through further review, right? So they found that people were very much sort of substituting this tool as a tick box sort of legal and moral assessment of a strike with their own judgment, right? So we have this movement towards substituting this very sort of cut and dried, black and white software judgment for sort of human ethical deliberation, moral conscience, responsibility, all that sort of good virtue ethics stuff, right? And this is the real problem, right? So what we have here is research already showing that people are, you know, pretty much turning off their deliberation process and just trying to get the machine to give the right answer. And that is not really kind of that's not something that we should be aiming for if we're thinking about ethics, right? We should be thinking about, I think, how do we supplement and make human cognitive processes better and support those if we want to think about doing better in these very difficult, very, very high risk situations, versus applying these very sort of simplistic black and white kinds of algorithms, right? So what you have here is, I think it's a fairly clear-cut case of what we call automation bias, which is where human beings will sort of take whatever a computer tells you and assume that the computer knows better than you do. So if the computer says the strike is good, you know, accept that answer, don't question it. If the computer says that, if your computer vision algorithm that you're using in your targeting says, hey, this is a military-aged male, it's a valid target, don't question it. So I think it leads us into some very sort of high-risk, very, very problematic things, right? Then another thing that's kind of particular to the war situation is that these situations are very dynamic. No conflict is the same. You know, geographies vary. The identity of who is fighting may vary. The way that the tactics that they use may vary. The weapons that they use may vary from time to time and place to place. And in particular, where you get into your less weapons that, or any sort of system that needs to operate based on human beings in this very sort of human fighter centric type of context, you really run into this sort of big problem, which is that there's no really sort of theoretically valid model of a competent that stays stable over times and different places. It looks, you know, competent looks different everywhere, right? So there's no sort of computationally valid way to do that determination that that really sort of, in my view, would fulfill what IHL asks you to do, which is to, you know, actually assess the behavior of these competents and show that they are that they're fulfilling a continuous combat function. So any system that tries to do this is just going to be inaccurate and lead to sort of bad results, I think. So, you know, human control in these systems is just, you know, fraught with problems already, I think, where we have these systems that are already taking some active part in this deliberation process and sort of, I think, undermining that unique human ability to apply critical sort of context-specific judgment and to apply sort of a moral and ethical, you know, conscience to these things. So
there's an aspect I should have brought up as well that, again, maybe unsurprisingly connects this to domestic civil liberties issues. So at one point I contracted in the disaster relief space, briefly for reasons you'll find out. And at one point I was asked to build a visualization system on top of cell phone, like ad tech location tracking data for the nominal purpose of tracking refugee flows near conflict zones. And the argument being made to me was that if you want to protect a nonprofit like a Doctors Without Borders that's operating, in the vicinity of one of these war zones, then you need to surveil refugees, because wherever refugees go, there tends to be conflict. And so obviously, there are severe legal issues as well as moral issues surrounding the type of surveillance that goes into these collection schemes. I would say most notably, there's a company called X Mode Social, which started out under the name Drunk Mode Social, which was to prevent you from drunkenly texting people, if I'm not mistaken, like college students. And then they realized they'd make a lot more money by selling location data to the Department of Defense. And so even it turns out that that company also got data from an app called Muslim Pro, which was a Muslim prayer app non-consensually, and was selling this location data, including to US Special Forces. And so, there's a broader conversation that, we all had in the Snowden era, that breaking encryption is not an us versus them issue, it's an everyone issue. And I think the type of surveillance that happens near conflict zones is also an everyone issue, because the type of data sources that might be used might be the same types of, applications, or they might source the data from that we all use on an everyday basis. And like I said, I've literally been asked to build that kind of thing professionally. Needless to say, I did not build it. So I think there's this question of, well, surrounding a conflict zone, like, to what degree do civilians deserve civil liberties anymore? Like, is it fair game, and in what radius surrounding a conflict zone to just spy on everyone? And so anyway, I think refugees should definitely be off limits.
Thank you so much, Jack. And yeah, and thank you for mentioning, the third-party data brokers, right? I don't think we focus on them enough sometimes in discussions, and the extent to which some of these third-party data brokers, right, the access that they have, the information that's collected, the permissible, regulatory environments that they tend to go to because of, a number of reasons. And for Laura, I mean, automation bias, right? People can relate to this quite easily. I mean, anyone who's ever used a GPS has had a situation where you go a certain way and you're going the wrong way, and the GPS is pointing you in a different direction, right? So I think that's all just fascinating parts of this conversation that go beyond, definitely go beyond the conflict context, right? So context, and something interesting to keep in mind. I've heard you both address a bit too, like the techno-solutionist views, right? And why it doesn't seem like those would work. And so what we get sometimes from proponents, sort of more of autonomy in weapon systems, and definitely the more techno-solutionist views, is that they highlight that these systems would be more accurate than human soldiers, right? Human soldiers make mistakes, certainly lots of crimes have been recorded. So some suggest that we can then even program systems with ethics or international humanitarian law to make war more ethical. What is your take on that? How does one go about programming ethics into these systems? Is that a possibility? Because I've certainly heard that argument made before, Laura, and then maybe Jack as well.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that we can make autonomous weapons or military AI more ethical somehow than humans is definitely prevalent. I mean, this is, I think, the most frequently seen argument or justification for developing these kinds of systems, for sure. So first off, people say that human soldiers make a lot of mistakes, and also that human soldiers make they turn into bad apples, and they engage in massacres. And I'm not going to say that these things never happen, but I'm going to say that these things are not as prevalent as will be made out. I mean, and these things are also not entirely outside of the control of human militaries. I mean, there's very good studies that show that when troops are under stress, when they've been on very long deployments and so forth, that the risk of these sorts of incidents does increase. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous of militaries to say, well, hey, we can solve this problem with technology, when there are other ways that problem can be addressed as well. And then in terms of accuracy, we already touched on that. So this idea that these weapons could be more accurate, I think it only holds up if you assume that they can do a better job of identifying competence versus non-competence than human beings can, which I think doesn't hold up for all the sort of reasons that we talked about, that there isn't a stable profile of a competent that is really suitable for these systems to recognize. You know, it's so context dependent, behavior based. Machine learning systems that we have at the moment are quite poor at kind of recognizing sequences of behaviors. They do a lot better at recognizing static objects. So, you know, a sequence of behavior that could mark someone out as a competent might span, you know, not only one instant in time or a few minutes, it could be, you know, hours or days or a very long period of time. So I think that's one kind of problem that we have. You know, one of the things that often comes up is this idea of you know, building an ethical governor, where you could build in kind of rules into systems that say things like, you know, never shoot on people who are surrendering, for example. But even that is one single rule, and to actually sort of implement IHL as a system of rules, I think, given the great variety of contexts and sort of the complexity that you could get into, you would need to have thousands of rules. Each rule would potentially have to, you know, you have to figure out how, you know, should it take precedence over this other set of rules, how things would interact. It would turn into something that I think would quite quickly be relatively difficult to manage. But the biggest problem really is, I think, the epistemological problem of, you know, how do you know things about the environment, and what in the environment is relevant to the decision-making process that your so-called ethical governor would have to make. And this is huge. I mean, this is known in philosophy as the frame question, and it's turns out to be computationally intractable to figure out what's relevant, or at least computationally intractable so far as anyone could figure out. Clearly, we humans managed to do it in some way, but no one's figured out how to make computers do this. But then just the element of sensing the environment is very difficult. So to go back to the example of you know, determining whether or not a person or a group of people is surrendering, there's a lot of different ways that surrendering can be done. It could be the white flag, it could be raising your hands. You know, people might be wearing all sorts of different clothes in all sorts of different kind of settings. They might be wounded or on the ground. You know, there's a lot of different ways that can look. And I think it's you know, just figuring out your surrender detection module and making sure that would work in all kinds of conflict situations now and in the future is very, very difficult, right? So, but then there's other people. So a good paper by Andreas Matthias, who just argues that the whole concept of having an ethical governor is flawed. And one of his big reasons is he thinks that in the case, the ethical governor sort of refers to the concept of James Watt's steam engine governor. In that case, the steam engine governor and the operator of your steam engine, like, they have the same goal. They don't want the steam engine to blow up, right? Whereas there's, in a military situation, militaries obviously do have a goal of making attacks. So the ethical governor is in some ways in opposition to some of the goals of the organization that is running it. And that's one of the reasons that Matthias anyway thinks that an ethical governor cannot work or would be problematic. And again, that's a little bit like what we saw with how the CDET bug splat system is used. You know, people just essentially play with it until they get the answer that they want. And there's no reason why people who want to make an attack but are using a weapon that's subject to an ethical governor, they could basically ask a bunch of different ways until they get the outcome that they want. So, and then, you know, there's back to the issue that, you know, ethics is not just about following a predefined set of rules. I mean, the role of kind of human conscience, the role of, I think, actually human beings and their ability to dissent, to engage in discussion about what norms should be is very important. You know, there's been a huge number of conversations about, you know, how it is that we should apply, what rules of engagement should be, what's ethical and what's not, and delegating too much of this, the actual engagement at the sharp end to robots or to software, you know, will mean that we don't have human beings making those decisions and engaging in those debates in the same way. So then there's kind of one final kind of problem here, right, which is, I think we're going to talk about norms a little bit later on. When we build these systems, we would have to, IHL is a big fuzzy kind of, you know, set of rules, and in order to actually implement that in software, you have to take a specific interpretation of those rules, and you will have to make a bunch of choices, and those choices are your kind of interpretation of IHL that you build your system on top of. It's going to be very much it's going to be opaque, you know. Your interpretation of IHL, your model of it, is not going to necessarily be right, but it's not going to be subject to a lot of transparency or scrutiny, and I think that's a problem as well. So Jack probably has things to say.
Yeah, so on this very important question of, you know, should the US military get to frame its incorporation of AI as actually humanitarian as opposed to about increasing lethality, you know, just that's a lot more insidious of an argument than I think people might realize, and this may come off a bit aggressive, but I'll say one of the best places to quote on this was a discussion between the Washington director of Human Rights Watch, who, you know, incidentally, Human Rights Watch is one of the leaders of the campaign to stop killer robot, but their Washington director is actually former US State Department, former DOD, protege of Samantha Power. They were in a conversation with Larry Lewis, who's a very big proponent of this concept of AI in the military being about decreasing civilian casualties. And what was interesting about it is that the way that, you know, obviously the framing of the US State Department is to argue that the US military incorporates AI both because it wants to decrease civilian harm and because it's forced to by adversaries who are developing these capabilities, supposedly without any of the ethics the US has. But none of us, you know, obviously, and even in these conversations, neither Human Rights Watch nor the State Department nor the DOD would ever accept that China and Russia are incorporating AI into their military simply to decrease civilian casualties. So that debate really comes down to a Manichaean view of the world that the US military is inherently good and that all other militaries are inherently evil. And I think we're all adults here and we can understand that the world is a lot more complicated than that, and the US military has absolutely committed atrocities in the past and likely will again in the future. And so, you know, but the point I was trying to make is that even in the pitch of that idea from someone like Holowinski to someone that is still in the US State Department DOD circles as opposed to just having left, is that actually, you know, decreasing casualties also increases lethality, was effectively the argument. And so, you know, keep in mind that none of these systems would ever get any money if they weren't explicitly arguing at some point that they increased lethality. And, you know, I've directly debated a general on this at one point, and what you find is they just really don't like you pointing that out. And the argument made to me was that you're not even allowed to use the word lethal, and that you have to talk about force overmatch. And so obviously, you know, rhetorically, you want to paint yourself as promoting peace and deterrence and minimizing civilian casualties whenever you're facing off against, say, a human rights oriented person. But when you're speaking bluntly to, say, you know, a president or another member of the armed forces, of course you're going to talk about effectiveness and lethality. So I think we have to accept that, you know, while these are not entirely disingenuous, that of course they'd also like to decrease civilian casualties. Even amongst themselves, they argue this is really about increasing, quote, effectiveness, which I think we all understand what that means in the context of the military.
Yeah, you touched on a great point here. This is the whole concept of the virtuous war which I think comes from Dergerian a number of years back. He wrote a paper on this, and he calls it a mythos. A mythos as well as an ethos, and the idea behind it is that it's almost sort of seeped in so far that IHL is seen as the only sort of true. IHL is very much seen as the only sort of true sort of bar for ethics. So as long as the military is, following the rules of IHL, everything is good. Whereas, of course, under IHL, you can do a huge amount of civilian damage completely legally, as long as it's proportional and based on military necessity, right? So, and the virtual war idea also very much casts any civilian casualties as, accidental. We didn't mean to do that. We couldn't possibly have meant to do that. We're the good guys. So it's that kind of discourse that we see.
Thank you both, and I've actually spoken to Larry Lewis, I think, a few times, and my point always has been, I don't think we can we don't have to necessarily choose in certain things, right? We can, increase precision, right? If that's sort of the aim, if the ultimate aim is to decrease civilian casualties, but that doesn't necessarily then lead us to have greater autonomy in certain decision making, right? That it's possible to work on improving these weapon systems without sort of crossing certain lines. I don't know how convincing of an argument I've made, but at least that struck me, that idea, I think, Jack, which you sort of nicely laid out, that some of this is taken as sort of fait accompli, and that we have a lot of interest and I think a lot of pressure on countries like Canada to to have interoperability and to be able to, participate in common agreements and missions, and that we shouldn't overlook how these sort of discussions are also happening and shaping these issues. Now, I have a lot to say on this, but let me, I have a few questions, and there's great questions coming in too, so I want to get to them. And I guess I want to, before we move on to what I think is, an absolutely fascinating aspect of this discussion, which is your own experiences. Just a quick question, you've touched on this too, about how do we respond to this at various levels, whether it's national or international. And Jack, you mentioned countries that, are considered to be adversaries, particularly of the West, and how there's distrust that these countries would follow any international agreement. So is it reasonable to think that, autonomous weapons need to be developed to combat other countries that have them? Is this sort of, is this what we need? Are there international regulations or national regulations that will be effective? Do you have any quick thoughts on this? Because I do really want to get to your own experiences as well, and your own sort of firsthand, some of which you've touched on already, but I think that would be fascinating for the audience too. Maybe Jack or Laura, do you?
So a huge part of what the Defense Innovation Unit has funded, and this is all quite public, is counter-drone systems. I don't really, maybe I'm not speaking for the broader human rights community, but other than the fact that NSO Group is one of the major companies in that space, and for anybody not familiar with NSO Group, they're infamously were allegedly, the hacking software used by the Saudi Arabian government to, ultimately dismember Jamal Khashoggi. They've also been used, in numerous places around the world, but one of the other things they sell is software to hack into drones to then take over control of them and land them. So there's a number of companies that do that. Those kind of, broader issues aside of what these companies do, I think, counter drone systems strike me as something pretty close to kind of defensive with a capital D. So I of all the things I'm going to spend time arguing against, that's not one of them. And so then you can ask the other question, which is, if another nation, or rather to maybe draw out the question you asked into the form of, if another nation has, say, autonomous drone swarm capabilities, is it enough to just be able to shut down their drone swarms? Or do you now have an obligation to be able to build your own drone swarms to respond? And I think it is worth asking the question, why do we assume that we have to respond in kind? Like I get being able to shut down drone swarms, but why do we have to do the same thing? And I suppose the answer would come down to, you know, the whole debate over the necessity of speeding up, you know, or decreasing, as they say, time between sensor and shooter would be the kind of term of art there. So I don't know. Frankly, I'll say I'm not an expert on that topic, but I would at least say it's worth kind of breaking that question up into the different components and debating each individually.
Thank you, Jack. Laura?
Yeah. So I think there's a tremendous amount of hype about an AI arms race that I think doesn't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. So it's, certainly when we talk about the big advanced military states, they have a lot of weapons at their disposal already. There is only there's only a certain amount of kinds of weapons that could do serious damage to one of the big military powers today, and I think we're highly unlikely to see the reemergence of sort of war between the large states anytime soon. And if we did, it wouldn't be drone swarms that will be making the key strategic differences. It would be the kinds of big missiles that we already have, and that, given the fact that there's a lot of space in between combatants and things only go so fast, I think there's a fairly limited role here for needing to make the decisions faster than they currently are. So I think there's always going to be those few seconds for a human to be in the loop if needs be. Where the question gets a little bit more interesting, I think, is when you look at the strategic position of smaller states that don't have so much in the way of big guns. So if it's quite interesting to look at the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh that happened toward the end of last year. Then this is sort of one of the first times where we've really seen two nations that have drones, but don't have a very developed air force going to war. And drones were definitely important in that conflict. And I think that we're going to increasingly see smaller nations relying on these kinds of weapons, more so than bigger ones. So it's really interesting that it's the sort of the big countries that have really brought these weapons to the fore when the strategic necessity is so much less. And it's kind of an interesting thing. So my view on this is I don't think that AI or autonomous weapons or drone swarms are going to be that strategically important for the countries that already have huge, powerful militaries. For smaller countries with less powerful militaries, they'll probably play some role. So what does that mean for regulations? I think that I still think that it's in everyone's interest to have regulation on these things. One of the very big concerns that people have about the possible impact of more autonomy in weapons is that there may be a threat to stability. So stability is the idea that it shouldn't be in anyone's interest to strike first. And therefore nobody, it's not rational for anybody to start a conflict. The problem, of course, that we have with autonomous weapons is that they are not rational. They are sort of Rube Goldberg machines made out of software, and they're flying around potentially, or ambulating around in some fashion in a very complex and unpredictable environment with unpredictable kind of sensory inputs. So there's a lot of people worry that we'll have a sort of a strategic corporal effect where it's possible for a weapon that has been deployed in autonomous mode to unintentionally spark off a larger conflict. So I think that's the sort of thing that I think everyone, large and small nations, ought to be worrying about, and that's why I think that retaining that sort of that current status quo of having human control over these things is very important, and in everyone's interest if people think about it rationally. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it's excellent, Laura. I mean, there's so much to be said on all these topics, and I have so many more questions, but I really wanted to get to this and really think it's important for you to have a chance to discuss it. So both of you have a shared experience in stepping back from working for a large tech company due to the concerns you had about the implications of the technology you were helping to build. So could you speak a bit then about your own experience and reflect on the role of developers, and what they can do in raising concerns about a technology being created, particularly when you're building one small component, right, of a larger system? There can be a sense of disempowerment, or yeah, Laura and Jack, I would love to hear from you on this, and maybe for the audience too. It would be nice to get some background on some of your own experiences.
Should I start?
Yes, Jack, go ahead,
Right.
please. Thank you.
Sure. So my first experiences in this space were all the way back to even where I did my PhD, which was in applied math. I started in aerospace engineering, which, not surprisingly connects with governments, but then I got recruited into applied math, which maybe surprisingly is much more connected to governments even than aerospace engineering. Broadly speaking, the field I was in, you can think of as kind of the offshoot of computer science, more to serve national labs and oil companies. So interfacing with organizations like Sandia National Labs was kind of in the cards from the beginning. And I ended up finding I did not get along with that. I never initiated myself, to put it that way, by accepting a security clearance. I kind of always avoided crossing the fence, so to speak, despite spending a summer at a national lab. And so when I became a professor, maybe not surprisingly, as a US citizen in that space, there was a lot of, basically free money thrown at me to contract for the Department of Defense. So I ended up having a DoD contract. It was a program called X-Data that people can look up, but which essentially, this wasn't the official mission, but people kind of whispered about it, was to create open source alternatives within the Department of Defense so they didn't get locked into a proprietary company like Palantir. And so think of, fellow people on the projects were like Julia developers, the scientific Python developers. In fact, the person who wrote NumPy originally was one of the people on this project with me. And so, but next door, there was a project called X-Data that actually quite a few of my friends were on. Essentially what it was doing was building the Department of Defense a special search engine to look through classified ads to try to find sex trafficking, which, is a legitimate thing, I'd say, for an organization like the FBI to be doing. There's a question of whether, a typical academic should be doing that. Anyway, so very early on in this project, I raised concerns with my program manager because all of the examples we were given were very sanitized, like analyze, basketball game data, or, here's some Bitcoin transactions, maybe analyze something about it. And you'd hear people in the background whispering about missile strikes and stuff. So you can ask, well, why is it, are you funding me to do this? And essentially the program manager made it quite clear he did not like me asking that question. And not only that, but I should understand that because the Department of Defense developed GPS in the past, I should understand that it's actually good to do military things. And so kind of what I learned from that in hindsight was that my cause for concern has only proven completely accurate. So if you look up companies like Giant Oak or ISP Research, which recently merged with a company called 26, it became 26 Technologies. They incubated in the very program I was in, and what they became businesses of is surveilling social media for like US Customs and Border Protection, for the FBI, setting up sort of international human intelligence networks and kind of doing the software backend. Maybe that one's a little less controversial, but the point is none of these ethical conversations were had. And in fact, you are actively discouraged from ever having them. Like basically, as a scientist, you're told to kind of do what we tell you. And if you complain too much, maybe we're going to not fund you anymore. So maybe I'll let Laura handle the kind of Google side, but I'll say maybe briefly that I left Google over their rollback of international human rights protections, And when I got put in touch with government officials later, all they wanted to talk about was what the military implications were for the alliance. And so the major lesson I learned is that, you know, for all of the puffery about human rights, ultimately it's a talking point for military officials. It's really something that they take as a given. But the thing that they really care about is strategic advantage, especially at this moment with respect to commercial alliance, because they understand very deeply that most of the AI is being developed in these tech companies. So there's a reason people like Eric Schmidt essentially outrank generals right now. Anyway, I'll leave it right there.
Thank you, Jack. It's interesting. Laura, you know, you have such an interesting experience too. It would be great to hear from you.
Yes, I definitely have experiences on why Eric Schmidt is interested in doing military work. In brief, I mean, I think a lot of this keys into surveillance because, you know, surveillance is such a sort of a key input into so many things. So military targeting, border control, policing, and you know, the reason that I think that all these cloud companies are interested in it is because it takes a vast amount of compute power to train these models and to run these systems, you know, far more than most sort of conventional non-machine learning systems. So, you know, you can make very big cloud computing bills with these kinds of technologies. And I think this is actually a really troubling thing because what it means is that we have these very big, very powerful technology companies that have built themselves a kind of a business incentive for to bring about widespread surveillance everywhere, because if they're running that, they can make a lot of money. And this really feeds into kind of why I left and why I made the decisions I did. Jack earlier touched on the whole thing around surveillance and in a conflict zone. You know, how close do you have to be to a conflict zone for your rights to sort of, your human rights and your civil liberties to sort of disappear? And what it turns out is that, you know, over the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of this very very long running and very pervasive form of conflict that spans, you know, many countries, not just confined to one single area for a few years or a few months. These very, very long, low intensity conflicts. And what this has meant for a lot of people is just living under pervasive surveillance for years and years. And if you read about some of the places in, say, the border regions of Pakistan and Afghanistan, where there was really long-lived surveillance done over years and years and years, you know, this actually had the impact that people would be afraid to meet in groups, for children to go to school, for people to go to each other's funerals, because they were afraid of the implications that any group or any activity could be seen as suspicious and could provoke a strike. So, you know, over time, 10 years of that, what have you done to, you know, a community? You've sort of destroyed its whole social fabric. It's you know, really quite an amazing thing to do, and particularly for these conflicts that are not necessarily you know, strategically necessary. So, but what we see and Jack has talked a lot more about the non-military side of things than I have, but you know, we're seeing this precise type of sort of pervasive long-running surveillance moving into the civilian sphere, particularly border protection, and particularly in certain cities as a crime stopping or crime investigating thing. And certainly surveillance can be necessary at times, but I think surveillance has to be targeted and has to be proportional. There has to be a good reason to engage in it. I cannot support building these huge surveillance machines that will surveil thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people at a time, all the time, which is exactly what programs like wide area motion imagery combined with software analysis that will let you play people's lives back and forward and build kind of social graphs out of their comings and goings. That to me is an outrageous level of surveillance that I don't think anybody should have to live under. And this is why I left Google. So I was not it was related to Project Maven. I was working in infrastructure, Google's cloud infrastructure, and I was asked to help to architect some changes to Google Cloud that would have let Maven run on Google's own machines, as opposed to handing it back to the DoD to run in their own data centers. So Google at the time was, talking a lot about how this would save lives and, help our soldiers and so on and so forth. But they were talking very little about the impact on the people who would need to continue for who knows many more years living under constant drone surveillance. And I found that sort of that lack of compassion and that lack of any sort of questioning about that exact question that Jack asked about, for how long and how widespread can we impose that kind of surveillance, and what's okay and what's not. The only answer seems to be, well, it's necessary, so we'll do it. It isn't necessary. We lived without that for thousands of years, and maybe we were better off for it. So yeah. Also, Jack, I can't believe that the person who built NumPy was involved in such shenanigans. Mind is blown.
Yeah, I can speak for a while on that. I'll briefly say that he's quite involved with In-Q-Tel as well, and kind of leave it there.
So thank you, Jack. Jack and Laura, I mean, I talked to you both about these issues, for hours, and, indeed have and would love to speak more, but there are questions coming in, and I'm going to get to the questions now. And I just want to say what I really appreciated from you today is that you've situated this discussion. You've provided sort of more of a power analysis and economic analysis, right? Understanding of how these links form and are formed. And sometimes this discussion on the use of AI in defense, and particularly on autonomous weapons, is described, it seems like it's happening in a vacuum, and it really isn't, right? It's all of these other things that are happening, including with surveillance, that you've touched on, that I so appreciate, because I don't hear that often enough. So, and I see the audience has some questions. I'm going to get to these right now, and if you have any, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them. The first question is, with all the concerns regarding AI's use in military applications, what are your thoughts on how or if AI should be used for conflict prevention or humanitarian assistance? Is there a role for AI there? Jack and Laura, any?
Yeah, I mean, so I literally worked in that space for about a year, and there's a reason I stopped. Which, fundamentally there is no, at least in the United States, I'm not an expert in, say, Canadian, government bureaucracy, but the example I'll give is that I agreed to contract with FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States. So they're kind of the official disaster relief organization. Now, for those of you that aren't aware, after 9/11, FEMA was placed into the Department of Homeland Security, along actually with the Coast Guard and the Secret Service, which most people don't know are in DHS. Anyway, so I agreed to this grant, and nominally the purpose of the grant was, hey, you're going to do some analysis of what happens if the power goes out and how this might impact 911 response. It's about as humanitarian as it gets. But to do that grant, I had to go in through the DHS, through their science and technology program. And as it turns out, I ended up being forced, because of the pure contracting reasons, to start working for a defense contractor to do the contract, who then immediately asked me actually to break the law because I was in Canada and to pretend I was in the US for travel purposes. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but the point is, I was at a kickoff meeting at DHS, and literally the second day of the kickoff meeting, the senior official for the program comes up and he explains, like, he's kind of bragging about it. And he says, I don't mean to get political, but what goes on at the border is very important to us. And whatever software you sell to us, we're going to find a way to reuse it to surveil at the border. Because the last time I was there, I had to wear a flak jacket. And I actually even got a journalist to get DHS to confirm this on the record. And the way they explain it is like, look, this is just financial efficiency, which is also what they told me, which is if you procure any sort of AI system within a department, of course you're going to use it for all of the missions in the department. So it's a long way of me saying, like, even if you want to do humanitarian work, you need to pay attention to who's buying it and what else they're doing, because ultimately efficiency dictates sort of reusing your work. And there's literally like no older narrative in this space than trying to package, you know, warmongering in the name of humanitarianism. And so, you know, I would say just don't quite take those things at face value. And I think if we really want to be clean and only work in the humanitarian space, that has to start at the organizational level, not just at the narrative level.
Thanks, Jack. Laura, any thoughts on this?
I have a few thoughts. So some of you may have noticed by my accent that I'm Irish, and yeah, so we've had some conflicts in my lifetime here, and I think that, you know, it's hard to solve issues around conflict with technology. I think it's, you know, we live in a very techno-solutionist age where we think that technology can solve all problems, but you know, based on what I've seen here in Ireland and Northern Ireland, it is mainly about you know, communication within and between communities. Political leadership is the key thing, you know, political leadership that's willing to, you know, negotiate and make compromises, and, you know, a vision of a better future, jobs, economic security, all this kind of stuff. And it's very visible to me how this year in particular, Brexit has just completely inflamed politics here in the north. You know, we've had last week was what they call marching season, which is where the unionists in the north have their annual parades and so forth. And yeah, they've been building bonfires like, you know, 80 feet high, you know, which is sort of an indication of how inflamed the whole thing is. So I think it's important to realize that human problems are human problems, and we probably can't fix them all with AI. And I think conflict prevention is one of those. So.
Thank you so much, Laura. And it's usually, you know, me who brings up Northern Ireland, having spent some time there, and the conflict. So, so it's good to see that, you know, there's others, and having someone from Ireland certainly is really interesting to get that perspective. And I think that perspective really of, you know, people who have experienced conflicts and who've, you know, lived through conflicts, the idea of some of these technical solutions are perhaps a bit more challenging to accept. So there's other questions coming in, and I want you to, yeah, please, if you have any, please pose them. So in the same sense that AI can cement institutional bias because past data reflect that bias, can past data of identifying enemy combatants be trusted? So for example, the Obama administration's policy of classifying military-age males as combatants would seem to make training such AI fraught with peril. So this is really a question that gets to this you know, the concern with data. And I've also heard mention in some of the UN discussions on autonomous weapons of using perhaps synthetic data. So, you know, there's a lot of concerns about data. Jack and Laura, what are your thoughts about, you know, the use of certain classifiers and the type of data available, and how problematic is that? How challenging?
So I might start on this because I talked about this a little bit earlier as well. Yeah, I think this idea of trying to build machine learning models for identifying competence is very, 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 very difficult. I mean, like I say, this is already a problem that we've found to be very difficult even for human beings, particularly where we're trying to do it based on aerial surveillance or signals intelligence, which is kind of, or, you know, electronic intelligence, which is mostly what we would have to feed into the computers anyway. So people think about the sort of the visual you know, machine learning based on aerial imagery. It turns out that identifying combatants in most cases from the sky is just hard. So people tend to very much base it on, you know, where do people go? Are they regularly visiting the house of a that's thought to be an insurgent house or a terrorist house, which may or may not actually mean that they are a combatant themselves. I mean, they may be the pizza delivery guy or equivalent, right? Then there's other criteria being used have involved things like are people traveling in trucks? In some places, a truck is just a normal a normal way of getting around, and sometimes people will travel in convoys for safety, so that isn't necessarily a good indication of being a combatant. Lots of other kinds of things like that. I mean, a lot of activity like bomb making, for example, that's quite difficult to see from the sky. People are normally going to do that indoors. So there tends to be a lot of sort of conjecture about targeting based on aerial imagery anyway, and a lot of it is just not sound. So that's one problem. And then the second problem is that another way that people do targeting is based on mobile phone data. So who's ringing, texting who? Are people swapping SIM cards in their phones? Are people carrying multiple phones? Things like that can be used as signals. And again, that isn't perfect either. You know, you're sort of building your social graph and you're assuming that because somebody is connected to a particular person that they may be a combatant, and again they may not be. They may just be you know, a non-combatant associate, but these are definitely things that have been used to target. You know, we've had cases where journalists who have been investigating terrorist networks have you know, signals intelligence targeting has decided that they're terrorists and you know, and struck them. So there's very little basis for actually building these kinds of systems. As you say, there's very little data where, you know, on strikes where people who have been killed have been actually validated to be combatants. And even if they were, it wouldn't necessarily be a valid target. Two big problems here. I mean, there's not enough data. You know, a good machine learning system would need a ton of data to actually be effective or be accurate or precise in any meaningful way. And then the second big problem is that if you're a group of fighters or terrorists and you find that you're being targeted by based on some piece of criteria, you're going to change your behavior, right? You'll start doing something different. You'll start recruiting different people, right? These groups change their tactics constantly. You know, think about it's been very common in the last few years to see, for example, suicide bombers in terrorist groups. It used to be pretty much exclusively young males. And then, you know, security forces in these areas started looking out for young males, and then they start to recruit women, and they start to recruit older people or children. So if groups find that they're being targeted because of a certain pattern, they will change that. Humans are very adaptable. So, you know, I personally think it's nonsense to even try to build a system that would do that sort of identification. And very much like Mike suggests here, I think it's very likely that it would sort of boil down to, if somebody tried to do it, it would just boil down to very crude heuristics like military age males, maybe of a particular demographic, so, or race. So yeah, I think it's a terrible idea. Jack probably has some opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I reject kind of the potential framing one could take away from this, that the problem comes down to kind of, you know, this sanitized setting of, you know, a person comes on camera and computer vision runs on it, and then you categorize them, and then you make a kill decision based upon just that output, and that if you just had the right data, that no one would get killed anymore, because it's just not that recent or that distant past that the US has bombed entire wedding parties. Like, this is not just a problem of identification. I think, you know, and maybe I'll leave it there and say I'd much rather hear an organization like Air Wars respond to this question than someone like me. I think certainly you want better data, but I don't. I worry it gets back to what we were saying earlier of the kind of techno-solutionist approach, which is, you know, if we just tweaked it and had better data, that everything would be fine. You know, of course you want good data, but that's not the only problem.
Yeah, I agree with all you've said. It's just not a problem that can or should be solved in this way.
Thank you both. When Laura was talking pattern of life, I was reminded of Dr. Sarah Shocker. She works with, she's a postdoc working with Dr. Mamani here, who has a book exactly looking at this sort of issue of, you know, how do you how combatants are identified and the implications of that. So some interesting work has been done in this, and certainly more that needs to be done. And I agree, organizations like Air Wars have been, you know, really noting for, I think, all of us, some of the concerns and challenges with the views of conflicts that we're getting. Mike also has another question. So Mike, thank you for all these questions. And I think what Mike is getting at here with this question is about, you know, the trends toward remote warfare, right? That is sort of the light footprint, less boots on the ground, and replacing them with PMCs and doing sort of remote drone strikes. So he's particularly concerned about the moral hazards of developing autonomous offensive weapons. So you've mentioned some of these points already, both Jack and Laura, but was there something else you really wanted to add to this idea of what we're actually seeing, the kinds of conflicts we're seeing, the kinds of engagements we're seeing are these remote engagements, right? We're not really seeing the boots on the ground as much. And we are seeing the deployment of private military contractors. And so do you have any thoughts on this, either Jack or Laura, about sort of the implications that more autonomous systems would have against this kind of background of remote warfare?
Yeah, I think we can definitely see the move towards autonomy is fitting into the same sort of remote warfare, and this idea of risk transfer warfare as well, where all the risk is, or most of the risk is, kind of moved away from occupying nations or occupying states, militaries to civilians and combatants in the states where the conflict occurs. So I mean that's definitely been a huge trend for the past 3 decades, and lots of people have talked about it. So given that remote weapons already exist, the way that this fits in is it will enable operation of remote weapons in areas where communication is not possible, and which is certainly a thing that's of interest, given that communication jamming has become more and more common in conflict areas. So I think we can definitely see it as part of that sort of same arc.
Thank you, Laura.
So I would say, you know, it's the official kind of policy of the United States that it's shifting to that sort of warfare in Afghanistan. So certainly, you know, that's going to be the way things are for a while. And maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek, I'd say there aren't too many places where I believe in a trickle-down economy, but one of them is definitely from the military to DHS to police. I don't know how many different examples we have to give of this. Obviously, I mentioned the full motion video one earlier. Just yesterday, I was reading about a firm that's existed for a while called Firebird AST, who even on their website brags that they've taken all of their kind of military counterterrorism techniques and they apply them even at the municipal level. And so, you know, keep in mind that a lot of this comes down to you trained people to do these sorts of things and they like to make money and there's no law against it later. And I would say, you know, beyond the remote framing of autonomous weapons, I think maybe an under-discussed component of is the force amplification side of it, which is you're empowering one person to do quite a lot of very detailed things. That also applies to police. You know, obviously we've seen, you know, Boston Dynamics dogs going around. They're far from the only company building autonomous systems. Like I mentioned earlier, the IDF using drones, shooting tear gas. There's a long-running trend of police doing more and more surveillance and being more and more militarized. And I think autonomous weapons are likely to make that much worse. So I think, you know, again, I reject the kind of dichotomy between domestic and kind of military concerns, because I really do think that history shows it's a spectrum where the border conflicts sit in the middle. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, both. There's just two more questions, and I want to get to both of these from Mike, but I'm cognizant of the time as well. So just some maybe quick thoughts on, Mike says, Laura mentioned the low likelihood that AI weapons will be used in large power conflicts anytime soon, and the smaller powers are more likely to use them. And how do you assess the potential to make strategic differences in asymmetrical conflicts, right? Are we going to see, I think, Laura, you talked about the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and sort of a bit of awakening there for smaller states, right? Looking at that conflict of the kinds of tools they might feel they need in future warfare.
Yeah, I think asymmetrical warfare is probably exactly where you do not want to have any sort of AI type weapons making any decisions. And the reason, or to even rely on them too much for analyzing your intelligence and so forth, because fundamentally asymmetrical warfare is all about doing what your enemy doesn't expect, being flexible, the element of surprise, and building a machine learning or AI system is all about recognizing previous patterns, being good at sort of spotting things that are happening that are similar to what was happening yesterday, and so on and so forth. There's a hugely long history of automation and technology failing horribly in asymmetric conflict. A great example of that is the Igloo White program. If people don't know about that, it was a program during the Vietnam era where the US tried to blanket the jungle with sensors of all kinds. So sensors that would detect noise, sensors that would detect human urine, stuff like this, with the idea of trying to figure out, where targets were, where guerrillas were. And it failed horribly. And one of the big reasons it failed was that the guerrillas pretty quickly figured out what was going on, and they would just avoid the sensors and send somebody to trigger the sensors somewhere other than where they were, so that effectively to create a distraction, right? And that's I think one of the very big weaknesses of putting a whole bunch of smart technology into your asymmetric warfare situation. Because what you're actually doing here is you are giving your smart, adaptable, human asymmetric conflict enemy ways to control the decisions that you make, and ways to control or to affect the decisions that you make and what you know. So I think that the outlook is poor for AI in asymmetric conflict myself.
Thank you so much, Laura. And Jack, perhaps I can ask you this question. What levers can developers pull to influence the morality of the technology they build? What role might organized labor play in this? And indeed, I had a question too about, whistleblower protections, right? Do we need to strengthen those? Do we have enough protection for people who then, raise concerns about the tools that they're building?
Yeah, I think there's a big stew that one could put a lot of that in. I'd maybe start by saying if there's one thing that I harp on when I talk to whistleblower community folks, is that it's harmful the way that it's always framed in terms of it needing to inherently be an isolating process of you versus the whole company, as opposed to talking about the fact that you can and should build support within your organization if you can. Not that it should be a requirement, but it definitely should not be ruled out that you might find like-minded people to stand up with you and potentially to, provide you some degree of anonymity within the company should you need it. But the more important kind of lesson learned I'd point to is that, when I've talked about ethics issues like this in the past, I find academics in particular have a very knee-jerk response, which is understandable, which is that people just need to take another class in ethics or something. And, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of thing. But I think the advice I would give much more is that there's a question of what do you do after you know there's been an ethical violation. It's one thing to determine there's been one. And so I think it's really important to know how to dig. And so I think it's not emphasized enough for people to learn kind of research skills. So for example, in Google, that it's a huge component of effective advocacy is research. So for example, for me with Dragonfly, it was when someone dug up an actual blacklist, and that blacklist literally contained the term human rights on it. Like that's been, you know, that was a pivotal moment for me, even being convinced, was seeing that. And, you know, that was someone taking the initiative. And so I think, and, you know, and likewise for Maven with the drone warfare, the company tried to lie to people. Like, you know, people will deceive you on controversial topics if they think that they would not like your response. And so you need a kind of, you know, stick-to-itiveness, if you will, or a degree of skepticism and willingness and ability to research things and to understand money flows. So maybe I would boil it down to start to learn how to track money flows, because if anything's going to shed light on situations, it's understanding that.
Thank you both so much. And as usual, we've run out of time with these excellent discussions, the great audience questions. Laura and Jack, it's always a pleasure. So I want to thank the organizing Waterloo AI Institute, as well as the graduate students engaged in this issue for this session. You know, my own personal view is that we sort of need more dialogue and discussions of AI applications with a broader group of stakeholders, and particularly people like Jack and Laura. And so I hope we hear from more folks like you, Jack and Laura. And to the rest of you, thank you for being a great audience and joining us on this day. If you are working on telecommunications, you know, technology, please continue. Clearly, we need more of that kind of work in Canada. And you know, this series, there are different sessions. You can look back at them, and you know, there's also another webinar coming up. So please do stay on the lookout. So thank you all so much, Jack and Laura. Like I said, always a pleasure.
Thank you, Branka. Thank you for the chairing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.